If you look at a map of the United States, Nebraska is the ultimate flyover state. It's that seemingly endless rectangle you only ever experience from 35,000 feet in the air, or blurring past your window on Interstate 80. But what if I told you Nebraska's emptiness isn't an accident? Rather, it's the only state in the country destined by its own geography to be completely ignored. I'm Jeff, and this is the bizarre geographic story behind America's most forgotten state. Nebraska is actually the only state in the country that feels completely empty on purpose. And looking closely at the physical map of the state reveals a fascinating geographic divide. It's a landscape of dramatic transitions, hidden ecosystems, and an invisible tilt that fundamentally alters the environment the further you travel. So let's start with where Nebraska actually and geographically sits. This is a completely landlocked state in the absolute center of the North American continent. It's bordered by South Dakota to the north, Iowa and Missouri to the east, Kansas to the south, and Colorado and Wyoming to the west. Because it's so incredibly far from any ocean, Nebraska experiences a highly continental climate. That means wild, unpredictable swings in weather, brutally cold, wind-whipped winters, and sweltering, humid summers, all punctuated by some of the most violent thunderstorms and tornadoes on the planet. But the real magic of Nebraska's geography isn't in the sky above it. It's in the dirt, the rivers, and the rock beneath your feet. And to truly understand it, we have to start on the eastern edge and walk our way west. The eastern border of Nebraska is entirely defined by water, the mighty Missouri River. If you stand on the banks of the Missouri in cities like Omaha or Nebraska City, you're not looking at a flat, dry plain. You're looking at a lush, green, humid environment. This eastern sliver of the state is characterized by gently rolling hills, deep, incredibly fertile topsoil, and tall grass prairie. It receives plenty of rainfall, upwards of 30 to 35 inches a year. To put that in perspective, wet and rainy Seattle gets about 40 inches per year. It's here in the far southeastern corner where Nebraska's lowest point sits at just 840 feet above sea level. But this green, hospitable environment is playing a trick on you. Because just a few hours west, the land is about to do something completely unexpected. Here is the biggest misconception about Nebraska. People think it's flat. It isn't. Nebraska is essentially one giant massive ramp. As you move from the Missouri River, the land begins to rise. It's a slow, almost imperceptible tilt, but it is relentless. For every single mile you drive west, the elevation climbs by about 10 feet. By the time you reach the middle of the state, the tall grass prairie has faded away. The air feels different here. It's distinctly drier. The skies seem wider. It's at this point that you're officially leaving the Midwest and entering the Great Plains. And cutting right across the center of this rising ramp is a geographic oddity, the Platte River. Unlike the deep, surging Missouri River in the east, the Platte is a sprawling, braided river system. It wanders lazily across the plains, carving a wide, incredibly smooth valley right through the heart of the state. This river valley is surrounded by a shifting, polarizing landscape. To the north of the Platte, you'll find a massive region of grass-stabilized sand dunes. It's a rolling, sea-like expanse of hills that looks like a grass-covered Sahara. To the south, the land turns into a flat, windswept plateau. The environment here is caught in a geographic tug-of-war between the humid east and the arid west. And as you keep pushing towards the setting sun, the arid west definitively wins. By the time you reach the Nebraska Panhandle, that weird rectangular block stacked on the western edge of the state, you're in a completely different world. The rainfall drops off a cliff, plummeting to just 15 inches a year or less. The lush, rolling hills of the east are completely gone, replaced by the rugged, harsh, yet strikingly beautiful high plains. The land literally breaks apart into dramatic canyons, dry badlands, and massive stone monoliths like Scott's Bluffs and Chimney Rock, which shoot hundreds of feet into the sky out of nowhere. In the far southwestern corner of the Panhandle, you'll find Panorama Point. This is the highest point in Nebraska, sitting at a staggering 5,424 feet above sea level. Think about that for a second. This means that the western edge of Nebraska is nearly a full mile higher in the sky than its eastern edge. It's literally higher than the city of Denver, Colorado. You have essentially climbed a mountain without ever noticing it. So Nebraska isn't just one flat landscape, it's a geographic treadmill that constantly changes the rules the further west you go. But this incredible physical transformation isn't just a fun piece of map trivia. This is the key to understanding everything that happened next. Because when the first human beings arrived, and eventually when waves of pioneers and settlers looked out across this massive sloping expanse, the geography of Nebraska didn't just tell them where they could live. It actively forced them to keep moving. Long before Nebraska was a state, a territory, or even a line on any modern map, its geography was dictating exactly how humans could survive here. For thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of North America didn't fight the geographic ramp of Nebraska. They adapted to it. In the humid, fertile eastern edges of the state, along the Missouri River, tribes like the Omaha, Ponca, and Pawnee built permanent earth lodge villages. They farmed the rich soil and relied on the annual rainfall to become skilled farmers, cultivating massive crops of corn, beans, and squash. But as you moved west up that invisible ramp into the drier, harsher elevations, farming became impossible. Out here on the high plains, tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne lived entirely different, nomadic lives. They were constantly on the move, tracking the massive, thundering herds of bison that grazed on the prairie. The indigenous population inherently understood the absolute limits of this land. But when the first European explorers laid eyes on this vast, sloping expanse, they didn't see a nuanced ecosystem. They saw a terrifying, empty void. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the United States desperately needed to know what it had just bought. Early American explorers, like Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long, were sent to map the deep interior of the continent. When Major Stephen Long crossed through the Nebraska region in 1820, he was so utterly unimpressed by the treeless, windswept plains that he famously labeled the entire region as the Great American Desert. He boldly declared it completely unfit for human cultivation and uninhabitable by anyone relying on agriculture. For a young, land-hungry United States, this presented a massive problem. How do you expand your empire across a continent when the dead center of it is widely believed to be an unlivable wasteland? The answer was simple. You don't conquer it, you bypass it. By the 1840s, the concept of manifest destiny had taken hold. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were desperate to reach the goldfields of California, the rich farmland of Oregon, or the religious refuge of Utah. But to get to those western promised lands, they had to cross the so-called Great American Desert. Nebraska wasn't the destination, it was simply the obstacle in the way. Fortunately, Nebraska's geography offered a saving grace. Remember the wide, shallow Platte River? Pioneers quickly realized that this was the ultimate natural highway. The Oregon, California, and Mormon trails all converged in Nebraska to follow the banks of the Platte River. Over 500,000 pioneers marched their covered wagons up this gentle geographic ramp. They carved ruts so deep into the Nebraskan dirt that you can still see them with the naked eye today. Yet despite 500,000 people walking directly across the state, practically no one stopped to build a life here. Nebraska was the ultimate flyover state before airplanes were even invented. That is, until the United States government made an offer that was simply too good to refuse. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, promising 160 acres of absolutely free land to anyone willing to move out west, build a home, and farm the soil for 5 years. Suddenly, the lush, rainy eastern edge of Nebraska looked incredibly appealing. Settlers flooded in, busting the sod and planting crops. Just 5 years later, in 1867, Nebraska officially became the 37th state. At the same time, the Union Pacific Railroad broke ground in Omaha, building the first leg of the Transcontinental Railroad. And just like the pioneers in their covered wagons, the railroad engineers looked at the flat, smooth valley of the Platte River and realized it was the perfect, ready-made grade for laying train tracks. To fund the massive construction costs, the railroad companies were granted millions of acres of land along the tracks, which they immediately turned around and sold to desperate immigrants flooding over from Europe. Driven by railroad marketing campaigns, people began pushing further and further west into Nebraska. They built towns, plowed the prairie, and tried to farm the land exactly like they had in the East. But there was a massive underlying problem. These settlers didn't understand the geographic treadmill they were walking on. As they pushed west, the rain simply stopped falling. Decades of brutal droughts, combined with the catastrophic economic collapse of the Great Depression and the devastating dust storms of the 1930s, broke the back of western Nebraska. Thousands of families went bankrupt, packed up whatever they had left, and abandoned the region entirely. Ghost towns began to litter the high plains. Between 1930 and 1940, Over 60,000 people left in search of a better life elsewhere in the country. In the modern era, the only way to survive in the western two-thirds of the state was through massive, mechanized agriculture. Family farms were swallowed up by massive corporate operations, using colossal irrigation systems. Because machines replaced human labor, the jobs disappeared. For the last century, Nebraska has experienced a relentless, agonizing, rural brain drain. The population slowly bled out of the western plains and pooled into the eastern cities of Omaha and Lincoln, leaving the rest of the state staggering under the weight of its own emptiness. Today, Nebraska is defined by this extreme human absence. But this emptiness isn't just a historic accident or a string of bad luck. It is the direct result of three very specific, unchangeable geographic features that forced America to build an entire state simply to ignore it. Nebraska's modern emptiness is often treated like a running joke, a punchline about endless cornfields and brutally long highway drives. But to truly understand why America built an entire state seemingly just to ignore it, we have to look past the stereotypes and examine the map. Because Nebraska's isolation isn't a cultural accident. It's enforced by three geographic deal breakers that mathematically guarantee its desolation. Let's start with the water, and what we call the Platte River Paradox. If you look at Nebraska's neighbors to the east, states like Iowa and Missouri, they exploded in population and wealth very early on in American history. The reason why was entirely fluid: the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. These massive waterways were deep, navigable, and incredibly reliable. Long before railroads or highways, steamboats were the lifeblood of the American economy. Because of these deep rivers, you could build massive wealthy trade cities right on their banks. Places like St. Louis and Kansas City became economic centers because the geography allowed heavy cargo to be moved with ease. Nebraska's main artery, however, is the Platte River. And the Platte is famous for one very specific, fatal flaw. Early pioneers had a famous saying about it: the Platte is a mile wide and an inch deep. It was entirely useless for steamboats. You couldn't float heavy cargo down it, which meant you couldn't build bustling trade metropolises along its banks. There would be no St. Louis of the Platte. But what the river lacked in depth, it made up for in topography. Its flat, sprawling river valley provided a perfectly smooth, level grade across an otherwise rugged and rising continent. It was the ideal ready-made path of the Oregon Trail, the Transcontinental Railroad, and eventually Interstate 80. Nebraska's defining water feature made it a terrible place to stop and build a major city, but the absolute perfect place to travel through. But even if the rivers were useless for trade, why couldn't millions of people just set up dense, small-town farming communities like they did in Ohio or Indiana? Because they were about to hit an invisible wall. Cutting straight down the middle of the United States is a longitudinal line known as the 100th meridian. It's the ultimate invisible climate boundary that chops the country in half. East of this line, the atmosphere delivers enough steady rainfall to support dense, non-irrigated agriculture. West of this line, the atmosphere dries up. Nebraska is brutally sliced in half by this invisible wall. The eastern edge of the state, home to Omaha and Lincoln, sits safely on the wet side. It acts like Iowa, green, fertile, and more heavily populated. But the western two-thirds of Nebraska is trapped by the arid west. Without massive, incredibly expensive irrigation systems pumping ancient water out of the ground, you simply can't support dense farming towns. The climate refuses to allow a large population to survive here. But what if you could get the water? What if you had all of the irrigation technology in the world? It still wouldn't matter, because hiding in plain sight in the middle of the state is a geographic anomaly that makes traditional farming physically impossible, no matter how much water you have. Welcome to Nebraska's secret desert. Covering over a quarter of the entire state is a region known as the Sandhills. This is the largest sand dune formation in the Western Hemisphere. From a distance, it looks like endless rolling green hills. But that green is a lie. The Sandhills are nothing but massive piles of loose, shifting sand held in place by a very fragile, incredibly thin layer of prairie grass. When early settlers arrived, they tried to plow this land just like they did in Kansas or Iowa. The results were catastrophic. The moment the fragile grass was ripped up by steel plows, the wind blew the topsoil away, and the landscape instantly reverted back to a Sahara-like desert. You absolutely can't farm the Sandhills. The only viable economic use for this massive chunk of land is grazing cattle. But because the grass is so sparse and the soil so poor, it takes an enormous amount of land to feed a single cow. To make a living out here, ranches can't be a quaint 100 acres. They have to be tens of thousands of acres large just to support a single family. This distinct geologic feature mathematically forces the population density to stay near zero. When one family requires 50 square miles of land just to survive, you literally can't build towns, schools, or communities. The land enforces extreme, permanent isolation. So the United States didn't forget about Nebraska. It didn't accidentally ignore it. It used it exactly as the geography intended. Nebraska is the hallway of North America, a place designed to move people, goods, and history from one side of a vast continent to the other. And it does that job better than anywhere else on Earth. Today, Nebraska is home to just over 2 million people, making it one of the smallest states by population. But it is growing. Since 2010, it's added almost 200,000 people, which is impressive given that there's nothing in Nebraska. Hey, for a limited time, you can get a free month of ad and sponsor-free videos, exclusive articles, and a free world map of the Köppen climate system over on my geography community site, thebite.co. Just click the link in the description below. I hope you enjoyed learning all about Nebraska. If you did, be sure to check out this video all about the state of West Virginia. Thanks for watching. See you next time.